But let's start with Greg Palast, the investigative journalist, author, filmmaker. His most recent video or film, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. It's an absolutely brilliant a documentary. And you can find the information over at gregpalast.com. You can see it on Amazon and whatnot. And his website, gregpalast.com, his Twitter handle is Greg_Palast, just like mine is Thom_Hartmann. Greg, welcome back to the program.
Glad to be with you, Tom. Buenos dias.
Buenos dias, senor. ¿Cómo está usted? I mean, this is Bernie Sanders won in Mexico, essentially. Tell us about it.
Exactly. Really, in fact, all the dual citizens I know who voted for Bernie went back to Mexico and voted for AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He is the Bernie Sanders of Mexico in almost eerie parallels. And he not only won, he destroyed, he crushed, he demolished the opposition despite unbelievable and massive vote theft. He won 53% of the vote. The number 2 candidate got about 22% of the vote. If you can imagine, it really is Bernie Sanders winning, and it's just astonishing.
So how do you expect this to play out in Mexico? I mean, this is like, I've done this kind of thought experiment in my head. What if Bernie Sanders had won the primary and became president of the United States, for example? The first thing that would happen would be obviously the Republicans would fight him, but probably a lot of Democrats too, when he tries to do health care for all, free education for all, which is what AMLO, Mr. Lobrador.
Yes, he's known as AMLO by everyone.
Yeah.
And yeah, I have to tell you, I've come back from Mexico, and I just got off the phone with the journalists still down there, and they're saying everyone's just waiting. It's like the planet has changed, and Bernie's in, and now what? Where do we start? And I think he said that he's going to start with raising pensions, reducing inequality by restoring the value of safety net programs for the poor. This guy lived with the Mayans for 6 years, living just like them in their homes. I mean, he knows what poverty is. He comes from the working class like Bernie Sanders. And he was, look, the big question that the New York Times asked is, will he become another Hugo Chavez? And
it's a stupid question.
Because he speaks Spanish, right?
Right.
And I knew Chavez well, and I know AMLO, and I know Bernie not as well as you do, but I can tell you, he's very much a Sanders. That is, he was a mayor of a city, just like Bernie was mayor of Burlington, who, he was a pothole progressive. He just took care of the city, and that's what made Bernie popular there. Same with AMLO. Except a little bigger city, a little tougher, called Mexico City, and he really cleaned the place up. And through ending corruption and waste, he actually was able to do massive works projects, infrastructure, literally double stacked their freeways. He's a can-do guy, and that's what he's going to do. And unlike Trump, he actually knows how to accomplish infrastructure programs. He's shown he can do multi-million-dollar projects and end the wasteful ones. I think the first act of office will be to cancel this crazy boondoggle airport in Mexico City. But this is quite astonishing. And as Bernie found in California, this is AMLO's actual reelection. He won in 2006. I was down there investigating for The Guardian and Democracy Now! And he swept the vote in 2006, and they just plain stole it right from him. Daylight robbery. And I got to tell you, I think this is a lesson for Democrats. Are you listening, Mr. Gore and Mrs. Clinton and John Kerry? The good and great told him to just concede and go away when they stole it from him in 2006. Instead, 500,000 people went into the streets. He occupied the center of Mexico for many months. He never, ever conceded, and he made clean elections in Mexico his #1 platform item. He said, no, I don't care what the good and great say, that I'll be seen as a sore loser, et cetera. I'm not going to give up when the people's votes are stolen. And 12 years later, he's president.
What impact is this going to have on the so-called war on drugs and all these gangs that have basically, even if the news reports are right, and I'd love a reality check from you, Greg, you know this stuff better than anybody else, or anybody else I know anyway. the gangs basically even taking over entire cities, particularly along the U.S. border.
Oh, yeah. My God.
What can he do about that, and what do you think he will be able to do, or will do?
Ready for this one? 132 politicians and candidates were murdered in this election cycle by these drug gangs. Unfortunately, many of them conducted the assassinations at the request of the ruling parties, the two ruling parties that got crushed, the PAN and the PRI. And a lot of these murders called for by these politicians. I'm actually, very frankly, concerned about AMLO's own life. So can he clean it up? Yeah, because you had this lockup, this horrendous lockup between drug gangs and the elected officials. So, for example, in one state, a ruling party mayor called on a gang of a drug gang, the Guerreros Unidos, to murder 43 students, chop them up, dissolve their bodies in acid. 3 journalists went to investigate. They did the same to them. People have had it. And I think one of the first things is that they're electing a party which isn't owned by a drug cartel. That's a big, big difference. And the other thing is, AMLO is, while he will not be owned by the drug dealers, he said, this war on drugs, the different, on one hand, taking bribes from them and lying from them. On the next hand, literally bullets flying in a war with drug dealers has got to end. The war on drugs, like in the United States, is a complete failure, and it's done nothing but seize their government. People have had it. I think that's one of the early things that's going to end is this militarization of the war on drugs in Mexico, and of course the ownership of the parties by the drug dealers, because they're out.
It's like the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States kind of thing, both lost. I mean, this guy ran, on a third party. I mean, that's just breathtaking. What is this going to? How do you see this playing out in terms of Mexico's relationship to the United States, and particularly Trump's perpetual perpetual willingness to use them as a punching bag?
Let's put it this way. AMLO's about to publish a book called Oye Trump, Listen Trump. And he's called for Trump's arrest for seizing babies on the border and putting them in crates. You have to understand that the current president of Mexico said nothing, because they're not Mexican citizens. They are almost all from Central America. So the current Mexican president said nothing. AMLO said, okay, they may not be our citizens, but they're citizens of the world. Arrest this orange freak for violating international law. And the other thing he said is, now AMLO, like Trump, is no friend of NAFTA. And here, are you ready for this one? The number one demand on Mexico by our NAFTA negotiator is that they raise the wages of auto workers in Mexico. And so AMLO has said, you got a deal, Mr. Trump. Let's raise the wages of auto workers in Mexico. And you know where we start? Your Commerce Secretary, in charge of the NAFTA negotiations, owns 8 of those auto factories that are paying slave wages. So
Wilbur
you raise
Ross?
the wages, Mr. Yeah, Wilbur Ross.
The billionaire in the Trump cabinet owns a bunch of auto factories in Mexico?
Yeah, and here's the funny thing. Wilbur Ross, his negotiating team has said number one demand on Mexico is raise the wages of auto workers. And so AMLO says, fine, tell Mr. Ross to raise our wages. This is Trump's nightmare. And also, it is hope not only for Mexico, but it shows what can be done when people say, no, you can't steal any more elections. No, you can't have an oligarch-owned political elite. We've had it.
Yeah.
And, and I think that this will be inspirational for the Bernie Sanders of America.
I absolutely agree. Finally, Greg, as we're running out of time here, we have Guatemalan, El Salvadoran, and Honduran citizens traveling all the way through Mexico to the United States to try to get in because of the wars that Ronald Reagan started in those 3 countries. And, they continue to this day. There's right-wing death squads and whatnot that John Negroponte took down to El Salvador, or didn't take down, but, he shows up and people start showing up with bullets in the back of their head. Same thing happened in Iraq. why is Mexico, or are they coming to the United States because Mexico is saying you can't stay in Mexico? I mean, what's the dynamic here? And to what extent is Mexico willing to absorb some of these people or become an activist with regard to these countries on their southern border?
Well, the problem for the refugees fleeing the drug lords of El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala is that by going to Mexico, they're actually at the mercy of the drug lords trying to take them across the U.S. border. So there's no sense stopping in Mexico to trade one set of gangs for another set of drug lords and gangs, to be harassed by both and abused, raped, murdered, enslaved by Mexican drug lords and their political allies.
So if AMLO can break the back of the drug lords in Mexico, which, by the way, is what RFK and JFK tried to do in j/61, you know, the year before Kennedy was elected, there had only been 17 prosecutions of organized crime, and J. Edgar Hoover denied that the mafia even existed because he was being blackmailed by Trafficati. The next year there were over 700 prosecutions, which is what led Trafficati and Marcello to put out a hit on Jack Kennedy, and then later on Bobby. How do you see this playing out, Greg? We got 45 seconds till we hit a hard break.
Okay, I don't see any more help from the Mexican drug lord infested government for the drug lords of Central America. This will change the whole game in North America. And again, when you also say no more stolen elections, I think that changes everything, not only to the south of Mexico, but to the north.
So you think this election in Mexico will have an impact in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras?
Yeah, because you're not going to have drug lords find succor and help and comfort in the government to the north.
Yeah.
You won't have that type of terrifying enclosure.
Because the drug lords are essentially the Koch brothers of the South, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating stuff. Greg Palast. GregPalast.com is the website. If you haven't seen The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, check it out. It's really worth watching. And Greg, thanks so much for being with us.
Adios.
Adios. Yeah. Again, you can tweet him at Greg_Palast, Palast.